Tonight, 7 party leaders are debating the big issues of the election campaign live here in Salford. Later in the campaign, there will be debates produced by STV in Scotland, by ITV Cymru Wales, and in Northern Ireland, a UTV debate involving the 5 distinct and separate major parties there. Viewers elsewhere in the UK will also be able to see the UTV debate. Time now, though, for our third question, which comes from Joan Richards.
Hi. As a part of Europe, immigration is inevitable. If you were elected, how would you address the issue of immigration?
Joan, thank you very much indeed for that. Ed Miliband.
Joan, thank you for your question. I've changed Labour's approach on immigration because I don't think it's prejudice to worry about immigration. I think people's concerns are real and they've got to be dealt with. And I want to explain how we'll deal with them. If I'm elected as Prime Minister, we'll put in place new rules which say that if you come to this country, you won't get benefits for at least the first 2 years. And we'll also do something else, which I think is of a concern to many people in our country. We'll stop the undercutting of wages and conditions that happen so often. Employers exploiting migrant labour, not paying the minimum wage, recruiting only from abroad to undercut wages. There have been just 2 prosecutions for failure to pay the minimum wage in the last 5 years. We've got to deal with it, and if I'm Prime Minister, I will. There's one other thing I'll say to you, though. If you want a party that will cut Britain off from the rest of the world, that's not me. I believe we've got to play our role in the world. But if you want a party with controls on immigration, that's what I offer.
Ed Miliband, thank you very much indeed. Leanne Wood.
Plaid Cymru won't go along with the scapegoating of migrants. It was not Polish care workers or Estonian bar workers who caused this economic crisis. It was bankers, and we shouldn't allow the rhetoric that blames immigrants for all of our ills. There's a reason why there's a strong anti-immigration feeling in areas where there is little immigration, and that's because often those areas have not shared in the wealth that has been generated. There are gaps in the Welsh economy and there are certain skills that we need, but sadly the debate around immigration has stopped those gaps being filled. We talked earlier on about the Welsh NHS. We have fewer doctors per head of the population in Wales than other parts of the EU, and this immigration debate has not helped that problem, it's exacerbated it.
Leanne Wood, thank you. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, Joan, we do need strong and effective controls on immigration. We need to make sure people don't get away with abusing the systems that the rest of us pay for. We also need to recognise that in parts of the UK there are a strain on housing and public services. I take the view, though, that the answer to that is investing more in homes and in our public services and in enforcing a decent minimum wage, not in scapegoating immigrants. I think the views of the Westminster parties on this issue have been driven by the fear of UKIP rather than by rational debate. And I think we need to have a balanced debate. So here's some facts that we need to bear in mind. EU immigrants are net contributors to UK public finances. The majority of migrants work. A majority of those who don't work are students. And let's also not forget that hundreds of thousands of British citizens go to live in other countries. How would we feel if they were spoken about or treated in the way that migrants often are here? So let's have a debate, let's not duck the issues, but let's make sure it's a decent and a civilised debate, not one that's driven by the intolerance of Nigel Farage.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you. David Cameron.
Well, thank you, Joan, for your question. What we need in our country is to recognise that people who come here and work hard and contribute to our companies and to our communities, they help make this a great country. But we do need immigration that's controlled and fair. And in recent decades, it has been too high, and I want to see it come down. Now, we have reduced immigration from outside the EU, not least by putting in place a cap on people coming to work here. But inside the EU, not least because we've created more jobs than the rest of the European Union put together, immigration has been very high. So we need to bring that under control, and here are the proposals that I will put in place as Prime Minister. First, if you're coming from the European Union, you won't get unemployment benefit. Second, if you've been here for 6 months and don't have a job, you'll have to go home. Third, if you've come here and worked, you'll have to work for 4 years paying into the system before you get out of the system. And finally, if you leave your family at home, you won't be able to send child benefit as you can now back to your family at home. Those are fair changes that I can deliver.
David Cameron. Thank you, Nigel Farage.
Well, Joan, I told you at the start they were all the same, that they all agreed, and they do. They all agree they should be part of the European Union. So the answer to your question is, as members of the EU, what can we do to control immigration? Let me tell you, nothing. Nothing. The Prime Minister can talk about benefits. Ed Miliband can talk about benefits. This isn't about benefits. This is about numbers. And we have a total open door to 10 former communist countries and to the Eurozone, where people are suffering very, very badly. I don't blame a single migrant that comes to Britain from Eastern Europe wanting to better their lot. It has depressed wages. It has led to such a crisis in housing. You know, we have to build a new house, one house every 7 minutes, just to cope with current levels of immigration. We need to change our relationship with Europe to one of trade and friendship, take back control of our borders and put in place an Australian-style point system, and 77% of British people want something done.
Nigel Farage, thank you. Nick Clegg.
Well, I will never spread fear about immigration, because I think we just need to remember there's basically good immigration, there's bad immigration. And Joan, in a bad immigration, of course that needs to be stopped. That's why I've introduced new checks at the borders to bear down on illegal immigration, why I've increased the penalties against unscrupulous employers who employ people and exploit them from elsewhere, why if people now want to seek benefits, they have to learn English. But there is also good immigration. We should remain a decent, generous-hearted, open-minded nation who welcomes people who want to come here, play by the rules, pay their taxes, create jobs, help in the NHS. If we turned everybody away, the NHS would collapse overnight. So I guess my approach to immigration can be summarised simply as this, that I want Britain to be open for business, but not open to abuse.
Nick Clegg, thank you. Natalie Bennett.
Well, first of all, in terms of European immigration, we celebrate the free movement of people in the EU. And as Nicola alluded to, many Britons have been able to take advantage of that to do what they want with their life. That's a real plus. But if we think about non-EU immigration, what we need is a controlled but fair and humane system. And that's not what we've got now. Just take one example, the fact that a quarter of appeals against asylum refusal, people who've often been victims of torture in their own country. These people, we've come here, we've left them for years, and then eventually say, yes, you are a refugee after all. Now, I think when people talk to me about immigration, they often say they're concerned about three things. They're concerned about low wages, crowded schools and hospitals, and housing problems. All of those are important, critical issues we need to deal with, but they're not caused by immigration, they're caused by failures of government policy.
Natalie Bennett, thank you. And I'll turn to David Cameron as we open up now after all of your opening statements to the debate, and perhaps pick up there on Natalie Bennett's point that she put across, that immigration is to be celebrated.
Well, we do have benefits from immigration, as I said in my opening statement, but I think the choice really boils down to this. Nigel is saying there's nothing you can do inside the European Union, so just give up and leave. And Ed seems to be saying he doesn't want to renegotiate anything in Europe, so just give up altogether. I say get stuck in, renegotiate, get the changes we need, and then put those in an in-out referendum to the British people by the end of 2017. I've sat around that table in Europe and negotiated for Britain. You can get things done, and I've set out what I want to get done so that we can sort out this immigration issue once and for all.
But Mrs. Merkel, who is the real boss in Europe, as we all know, has made it perfectly clear you can negotiate lots of things over the next couple of years, but you cannot renegotiate the free movement of peoples within the European Union, and that is backed up by the Commission President and the President of the European Council and the overwhelming majority of the European Parliament. Do you accept or not that in your renegotiation, free movement is not up for discussion?
I don't accept that. Nigel is basically saying, give up before you've begun. In fact, if you look at my track record on Europe, I said we cut the European budget. People said it was impossible. We cut that European budget. I said, let's get out of these bailout funds where British taxpayers' money was being put into countries like Greece. People said, you'll never do that. We got out of those Greek bailout funds. So instead of giving up, let's get stuck in and negotiate. And the problem with Nigel in the end is ultimately, Nigel, you're just the back door to a Labour government, which will give us open-door immigration, which is not what this country
Ed
wants.
Miliband. Ed Miliband.
I mean, David, I'm wondering what world you live in.
I think we all wonder that.
You talk about your negotiating skill in Europe. You made a big stand against the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. You lost by 26 votes to 2 because you had no allies. And the problem is David Cameron has marginalised us in Europe. Now, look, I just want to be honest with people at home. There are false promises you get from David Cameron. He stood on this stage 5 years ago and said net migration into the tens of thousands. And he actually said, kick me out if I fail to deliver. Well, I suggest you do. But he failed on that promise, and he's going to make the promise again. And there's false solutions from Nigel Farage. I've just got to be frank with people. I don't think our place lies outside the European Union. I think that will be a disaster for jobs. I think that will be a disaster for families and businesses. Let's change Europe so it works better for us, including on immigration, but let's not sacrifice jobs, businesses and families.
Nick Clegg.
I think as far as immigration in the European Union is concerned, firstly, I'd say the freedom to move around the European Union should never be the same as the freedom to claim benefits on the first day you arrive, no questions asked. And you have to split those two things off, and that's something that we have done. Secondly, it is a two-way street. There are almost as many Brits living elsewhere and living and working elsewhere in the European Union than there are Europeans working here. And finally, if we want to make sure that our own youngsters get the jobs that other people from elsewhere in Europe might want to get, we've got to train them up. And one of the things I'm most proud of over the last 5 years is that we've now got 2 million people starting new apprenticeships. It's the biggest increase in apprenticeships since the last war. And by the way, over half of those are women starting apprenticeships. So train up our own youngsters so that they get the jobs which they apply for here at home.
Nick makes an important point, which is that if you want to control immigration, there are 3 sides to this coin. You've got to have an education system that turns out young people that can do the jobs that our economy is creating. You've got to have a welfare system that makes sure that work always pays, and we've really helped to deliver that over the last few years. And you've got to have the immigration changes that I've been talking about. It's not simply about what happens in Europe. If I think of what we inherited, we had bogus colleges that were handing out visas like visa factories. We've shut them down. We had people who could claim benefits literally on arrival when Ed Miliband was in the cabinet. We've stopped that. We had people appealing in our courts against decisions made here. We've now said you have to go home and appeal from home. There are changes you can make if you make this a priority.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, before we go any further, can I just remind all of us that diversity is one of our great strengths, and I can see that as I look out to this audience. Decisions on immigration should be driven by what's good for our economy. And the problem we have with the debate right now that's been driven by UKIP and Nigel Farage is that it's leading to some wrong decisions. Take one specific example. When David came to office, he abolished the post-study work visa. Now, the abolition of that is hurting our universities, making it more difficult for them to attract international students. But it also means that we deprive ourselves of the economic contribution of young foreign students that we've helped to educate here. It makes no sense. And the last point I would make to David is if there are changes needing made in the European Union, then surely the best thing to do is to try to build alliances to make those changes, not act like a petulant schoolchild threatening to leave if you don't get your way. It's better to try to work together for that change.
Leanne Wood.
I think UKIP have shown their true colours tonight. Really, all this immigration rhetoric is all about pulling out of the EU. Now, I recognise there are many problems with the EU, but Wales benefits from being a member. And I would say that if there is a referendum on the future membership of Britain in the EU, then the votes should be taken separately in each of the 4 countries, so that if we are to pull out, it only happens when all 4 countries agree, so that you don't just have the biggest nation pulling everyone else out.
I'll come to you in a moment. Natalie Bennett first, then to Nigel Farage.
Well, I want to partly agree with Nicola that we need to talk about the nature of the debate, but I disagree with her that this is a debate about economics. First of all, it's a debate about human lives. And if we look at one particular aspect of our immigration policy now, you have to be, if you have a non-EU spouse or partner, you have to be earning more than £18,600 a year. Your spouse or partner's salary cannot be counted. A judge described this as unfair and unreasonable. 19,000 Britons can't live in their own country with their family because of that rule. And a challenge to David Cameron, Syrian refugees. The UN has asked us very loudly and clearly to take our share of the most vulnerable Syrian refugees. You said, no, we're not doing that, we're taking our own programme. The last figure that I saw in that, we'd taken 143 Syrian refugees. I say to you, we should be taking our fair share of those most vulnerable Syrian refugees.
Let me answer that.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Nigel Farage there. A debate about human lives, Nigel Farage.
Yeah, quite right. And I was the first person to say we should take some of the refugees from Syria. I understand that. Joan's question, we've forgotten the question here. What as EU members can we do to control immigration? I've said it before, nothing. Nobody else here, even though they're pro the EU, will actually admit that. But can we get some sense of history on this? You know, if you go back even to the 1990s, from 1990 up until 1998, net migration as a measure into Britain was about 40,000 a year. In the 80s, it was lower than that. In the 50s, it was slightly higher than that. The point is this: since World War II, we've operated with net migration into Britain at an average of about 30,000 a year. It is now net 300,000 people a year. It is 10 times anything this country has had to live with since 1945. And what it's meant is for ordinary folk on minimum wage or not very high salaries, their wages have been compressed. It is the ordinary people of Britain that have paid a very high price for the big corporate employers who've benefited
So raise the
from
minimum
low,
wage.
from low
Living wage.
I want to bring in Nick Clegg to this point.
Well, I think the answer to that is to raise the minimum wage, which we're now doing so far faster than we ever have done before. Train up more apprenticeships, which we're doing on a scale we never have done before. But Nigel Farage talks about remember history. I mean, the Farage family were foreigners once.
Well, precisely.
I'm married to a foreigner.
Well,
you're married to a foreigner.
precisely.
But let's be open-hearted, generous spirited.
Should we control it? Should we control it?
All I'm saying is,
should we control it?
No,
That's
we should
the question.
Stop bad immigration, but don't paint everybody with the same brush.
How? Joan's question is, how do you control immigration as an EU member? Be honest with people.
Well,
we can't.
And what you say,
tell them the truth.
Well, I will tell exactly the
Tell
truth,
them
which
the
is
truth.
that the freedom to move around the European Union should not be the same as the freedom to claim.
That's irrelevant.
Yes, it is not
It's
irrelevant.
irrelevant. This is not about benefits. It's about movement of people.
But your problem is you seem to imply anyone who's foreign who comes to this country is a menace. We simply
we've
can't,
said
as a
nothing of
country,
the kind.
we must
We've said
remain
nothing-
generous-spirited
we've
and
said nothing
open-minded
of
to the rest
kind.
of the world.
You won't admit the truth, will you? The truth is there's nothing we can do.
Ed Miliband.
There's a crucial aspect of this
Ed Miliband.
debate, Julie, and a crucial aspect for people at home. David Cameron said earlier that work pays in our country. Rubbish. Work doesn't pay in our country. There are so many people around our country, millions of people watching at home tonight, who are going out doing all the hours that God sends and who can't feed their family, can't make ends meet at the end of the month. And let's take the issue of 0 hours contracts because it's relevant to this debate. If work is insecure, if work doesn't pay properly, then you don't get the security that working people need. Now, I say we should deal with those exploitative 0 hours contracts. It is an absolutely crucial part of this immigration debate because you've got to create security for the working families of Britain, and that's what I will do.
Well, let me answer these questions. First of all, to Ed Miliband, we've created 2 million jobs because we've got a strong and growing economy. When he was sat in the cabinet, about 500,000 people lost their jobs, so never mind 0 hours. With Ed, there'd be 0 jobs. But let me take on Nigel on this. Look, Nigel, you want to leave the EU. It's a very clear position. But the only way that can happen is by having a referendum. Now, I say stay in, fight, get a better deal, but hold that referendum. The irony of Nigel's position is if people vote for him, they end up with Miliband, and they get no referendum, no renegotiation,
I want to come back.
no immigration.
I want to come back on
no
that.
choice.
This is the second time.
Thank you, Nigel Farage. Thank
This
you,
is the
David
second
Cameron.
time in this debate.
Can I answer the Syria question?
I want to come back. I want to come back to direct.
Thank you, David Cameron. Thank you, David Cameron, and both of you.
Twice in this debate.
Thank you, Nigel Farage. Let's hear the point on Syria. Thank you,
I
David.
just want to be very direct. We have taken some people from Syria, some of the most vulnerable people, including elderly and disabled people. But the most important thing we can do in Syria is maintain the fact that we are one of the biggest, I think the second largest bilateral aid donor, helping people in those refugee camps to be fed, to be housed, to be clothed, and try to find a solution so they can go home. There are about 6 million people, refugees or in danger of being refugees. We cannot take all those people in, so it makes sense to use our aid budget to try and help them in the region and then help them get home.
Thank you, David Cameron. On that issue of leaving Europe as a means of controlling immigration, Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, Nigel Farage wants to take the UK out of Europe. I think in pandering to that, David Cameron is taking us dangerously close to the exit door. I'd like to issue a challenge to David, to Ed and to Nick tonight. They spent a lot of time in Scotland during the Scottish referendum talking about the UK family of nations. So will they give a commitment that if there is an in-out referendum, no one part of that family of nations will be taken out of Europe against its will? Will they give a commitment, as Leanne has suggested, that the votes will be counted in each of the 4 nations so that none of us can be dragged out against our will?
Well, let me answer that question directly. My priority is not to have an in-out referendum, and let me explain why. Because
But if
my
there is-
priority as Prime Minister is to tackle the cost of living crisis, sort out our NHS and build a future for our young people. And look, you know, the British people have a decision to make tonight and at the general election. David Cameron wants to spend the next 2 years deciding whether to exit the European Union, something he doesn't even want to do. He says he wants to stay in the European Union. So, look, I say there's better priorities for our country, and they'll be my priorities as Prime Minister.
Can we be clear that there would not even be a discussion about a referendum if it wasn't for the rise of UKIP? In 2012, David Cameron was opposed to Britain having an EU referendum, saying it wasn't in our national interest. For people out there that want a referendum, the only way it's going to happen, freely and fairly, is put enough UKIP MPs into Westminster.
Nick Clegg.
But I think Nigel Farage seems to think that every single problem in the world can be solved by a referendum on Europe. Look, at the end of the day, Europe isn't perfect. Of course it's not perfect. But it is the world's largest marketplace of 500 million shoppers who buy our goods and buy our services. So if you do what Nigel Farage or significant parts of the Conservative Party want, which is to yank ourselves out of the family of nations that makes up the European Union, unemployment will go up. And I would never, ever, ever endorse an approach which would make our country poorer and would see more people out of work. I think it is deeply irresponsible.
Natalie Bennett.
Well, what I will endorse is trusting the voters and believing in the people. And you have to be in your late 50s to have had a chance previously to directly vote on Europe. So the Green Party does support a referendum on Europe. But we would be campaigning very strongly in that referendum to stay in Europe, because we believe that Europe, there's certain decisions that should be made at that kind of level, like protecting our environmental standards, protecting our workers' rights. Those kind of decisions we need to set continents-wide standards for. But also, what we need to do is have a different kind of Europe, a Europe that's much less centralised, much less arranged for the big multinational companies, much better for local communities and local decision-making.
Leanne Wood.
I think that the rhetoric on immigration has not helped the economic situation that we're in. There are gaps in the Welsh economy that need filling, and this debate does not help. The one thing that I would agree with Nigel Farage on, and I never thought I would ever say
I'm looking forward to this. This could be fun, couldn't it?
But you are right when you say that you can't control immigration from within the EU as a member.
One honest member of the panel. Well done.
You have to accept that people will come here. We have free movement of people, and people will move out to other parts of the EU as well. And we expect our citizens to be treated well when they move to other countries. And likewise, we must treat European citizens well when they come and live with us in our communities too.
Nigel Farage.
An admission of the truth, that's fine. I tell you, it's very interesting, Leanne, this actually worked rather well. The free movement of peoples, when we were in with countries like France, Germany, the Netherlands, roughly similar living standards, roughly similar education and health systems, it didn't really pose any problem. The problem was, irresponsibly, stupidly, we let in 10 former communist countries where the minimum wage, say in Romania, is about a tenth of what it is here. And if you say to people in poor countries they can move to relatively rich countries, they do. The Labour government, and I think Ed's admitted this, got it horrendously wrong on the figures. But we now face the potential of a collapse in the Eurozone, and we have no control over the numbers coming to Britain.
Well, we did get it wrong, and I've said we got it wrong, and I've changed our approach. But I do think there's a wider issue here about the opportunity for our young people. Nick and David were saying how brilliant everything is on apprenticeships. Take an issue, IT. We bring lots of people into this country who are contributing to our country from other countries in IT, with specialist skills in IT. But apprenticeships in IT are actually falling in our country. Now, the answer is we should say that if you want to bring in a skilled worker from outside the European Union, you must provide apprenticeships to the next generation, because homegrown opportunity is an essential part of dealing with people's concerns about immigration.
Nick Clegg.
I strongly agree that apprenticeships, which is an old idea, the idea that you sort of earn and learn, that you learn the tricks of the trade while you're actually working on the shop floor, in the office or elsewhere, is a great old idea that we've given it new life. We've got 2 million new apprenticeships created over the course of this last Parliament. It's never been expanded on such a scale, and I think it is something that I hope all future Parliaments will continue with, because it is a fantastic way to allow youngsters to get their feet on the first rung of the jobs ladder.
Thank you very much, Nick Clegg. Thank you very much indeed, all party leaders on that issue.